Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends and the foes out there. Welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. Before I introduce today's guest, I'm going to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode and all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Do remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Today is the first episode that I'm filming in my ancestral motherland of Bangladesh. I am honoured to be joined by a celebrated journalist and an editor, a former barrister, and that's none other than Zafar Sobhan, the editor-in-chief of Dhaka Tribune, one of the fastest and largest English language newspapers in Bangladesh. Zafar bhai, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
How are you?
I am well, thank you for having me on your podcast. This is a great honour for me.
Thank you so much. How have things been in Bangladesh? It's been very busy, lots happening in the last 2-3 months since the protests, since Hasina resigning, even though we're yet to see a hard copy letter. I know that. Right. I know that's been the recent thing. How's it been for you?
For me, it's been like a night and day difference. Of course, in the post-revolutionary period, there's going to be a little bit of confusion. There's going to be a little bit of chaos. The country is still finding its feet. But for someone like myself, who is the editor of a newspaper, and in fact, I would say for the whole nation, it's like a breath of fresh air. Finally, after 15 years, you can breathe again. Are things perfect? Absolutely not. Are we still finding our way? Certainly we are. But when I look at today compared to where we were 3 months ago, it's a night and day difference. There is hope. There is faith that things are going to get better. And there's a real sense of, there's a real spirit in the air that Bangladesh is finally moving in the right direction. So it's a wonderful time to be a Bangladeshi. It's a wonderful time to be a newspaper editor, and it's just a great time to be here.
I mean, let's touch upon that. How muzzled were the media in the 15-year rule of Sheikh Hasina, or is this something that's overplayed by her critics and the students?
It's not overplayed at all. And here's the thing, if I'm being honest, it didn't start out that way. In 2009, when they first came to power, things were actually okay. What you saw was a steady deterioration over the next 15 years. And I actually have a presentation which I've given in other contexts where I show people what we were able to publish, let's say in 2013, what we were able to publish in the 2014 general election compared to 2018, compared to 2024. And each time you see a diminution of what we're able to say. Same thing with the Dhaka mayoral election. We could say a lot in 2015. You couldn't say that in 2019. So it got increasingly more oppressive. And after the 2018 election, it was really sort of lights out. And so it hasn't been overstated by any manner of means.
For our viewers and listeners who don't necessarily have followed the trajectory that Bangladesh has been in the last 15 years, what would happen then if you were, in the latter years, 2014 onward, critical of Hasina and her government and her policy?
It's not what would happen, it's what has happened and did happen to many people. You could be picked up. You had to be careful. Is there going to be a knock on the door in the middle of the night? The Digital Security Act was passed in, I think, October 2018. So since then, they had all of the tools they needed to pick you up, to hold you, to do really anything
on what
they wanted. On grounds of, under the Digital Security Act, even very basic political journalism, investigative journalism, was in many ways criminalized. And it was a shocking piece of legislation. And that's one of the things we in the media community are looking to the interim government to overturn. It hasn't been enforced since they've been in power, but we want more than that. We want the whole thing gone. It's now been turned into the Cybersecurity Act, but it has to go. And, people have been picked up. People have been disappeared. And you always had that sort of Damocles hanging over your head. You never knew. Bangladesh turned into a country where people would put their mobile phones away before they were going to have a sensitive conversation. They were always looking over their shoulder. If you were in a meeting, you were looking around the table, thinking, who's here who may inform on me? We had turned into a country. I mean, it kind of reminded me of, when I've read stuff by Milan Kundera about, communist Czechoslovakia in that period. Everyone was watching what they said. There were phone calls from the intelligence agencies there was all kinds of pressure. So it was not overstated by any manner of means. And some media outlets really were absolutely under the cosh. And some managed to maneuver and, keep their head above water. But it wasn't a pleasant time, and it wasn't an easy time at all.
Did you ever get a knock on the door or a phone call yourself?
I got phone calls all the time, and I had to become very adept at how to, dodge and weave and keep the wolf from the door. And, you learn how to play the game. You learn how, okay, I'm going to say no here, okay? This is where I draw the line. But every once in a while, you have to say, okay, well, we'll see how we can accommodate this particular. And sometimes it's not a request. I'll give you a good example, is that we were live blogging at the start of the student protest movement in July. There was a lot of protest activity at Jahangirnagar University, and we were live blogging that on Facebook Live. And we got a phone call saying you need to shut that down. And, and also part of my job is to understanding when they really mean business. And so, I could tell that this needed to be shut. And so I passed on the word and I said, hey, listen, we're going to have to go off. Because what happened is no one else was doing it live. It was only us. And so this raised a lot of alarm bells. So sometimes you could push back, but most of the times you had to really kind of knuckle under. And my job as the editor was to be able to navigate those waters, to understand when I could push back and when I had to pull back myself.
Now, before we started filming, I asked you about writer's block.
Yeah.
And then you said to me that, look, Dilly, the 15 years or so, just this period before the revolution, the protests, you were kind of muzzled, and so therefore your silence was kind of the statement.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about what we were talking about.
Well, absolutely. I moved back to Bangladesh in 2003. And since then, so it's been 20 years plus, I had a weekly column, Straight Talk, which I brought out every week without fail for over 10 years. And, and the name of the column says it all. And I have, if I say so myself, I have something of a reputation for speaking my mind, being a straight talker, saying what needs to be said. And as the appetite for those kinds of articles diminished, and as we were under more and more pressure, and I felt that I was not able to write what I wanted to write, I stopped writing for many years. It was not the entirety of the 15 years. It was a slow process, but it was probably after the 2018 election. I don't think I wrote at all for several years because I just felt that if I can't say what I want to say, I'd rather say nothing at all. And as I said, my silence is my statement, and it is very interesting because I mentioned this earlier to you, probably in about 2015 or 16, I'm not entirely sure of the date, I wrote an article about Hasina's prosecution of the war on terror, where I titled it George W. Hasina. And that went down very poorly with her. But in 2015, 16, you could still write articles like that. I wrote some fairly tough critical pieces all through up until that time period. But were I to try and write an article, George W. Hasina, in 2023-24, I don't think that would have flown.
Yeah.
That space had shrunk.
You might not have been here to be having this interview.
I would not be here to have this interview, or, maybe I would be today, but, 6 months ago, certainly.
Did you ever feel ethically compromised?
Well, I'll tell you something. It's a very interesting question. It's a question I, as an editor, asked myself constantly. You see, here's the thing. When you are operating in this kind of an environment, on the one hand, you know that people understand the environment and they understand the limitations which you are operating under. And, they learn to read between the lines. They know you can say only so much, you can't go further. But what you have to ask yourself as an editor is, at what point does my silence become complicity? And that's an interesting question to ask.
Yeah.
You see, you have to ask yourself that question. And so every day I would actually ask myself that question. And you want to make sure that, if at some point you feel that your silence makes you complicit in the atrocities which this government is perpetrating on its people, then you need to walk away. Every day I was able to put out something, and even within the limitations, I believe that within the Dhaka Tribune, we could put out valuable content, which was important and protective and reflective of what Bangladeshi people needed to read and wanted to say. So I always felt that there was something of value in my newspaper, even within the limitations. And as long as there was something of value, I wanted to continue putting it out. And one of the things which was very interesting is during the July Uprising, and I remember I had a sort of a decision to make, and I made the decision to completely pivot at that point and be fully supportive of the uprising and be fully supportive of the movement. Because at that moment, my assessment, my moral, ethical, journalistic assessment was to be holding back would be to be complicit, because we were seeing people being shot dead. We were seeing, massacre. We were seeing atrocities. And at that point, my assessment was my silence at this particular moment in time would not be forgivable.
Well, one of the sentiments that I've noticed, or grievances that I've noticed from the students and some of the coordinators I've spoken to, is that many of Bangladesh's media didn't do enough. There was a sense of sitting on the fence, joining the party late.
Yes.
Do you think there's any validity to that?
Well, there's a lot of validity. I mean, they're not wrong at all. That said, I mean, I think it is also, you have to understand the limitations under which the media were operating. They were facing a lot of pressure themselves. And so it's very hard. I don't want to look at any other editor, any other news editor, and second guess the decisions they were making in real time, because I don't know what particular pressures they might have been under. I've not been able to stand in their shoes. That said, I certainly think that television media certainly could and should have done more, Then again, and I see both sides. I used to be a lawyer, right? I see both sides as I think they were under much more pressure. We had more leeway in the print media to go a little bit further. So, I think everyone makes their own calculus in terms of how far you can go. Should many outlets have gone further? Probably. But I also think that many of the media outlets actually did a fantastic job in the face of a great deal of danger and in the face of a great deal of risk to themselves.
Charity is just a band-aid solution. In 2024, charity alone isn't enough. In 2024, is donating enough? Because giving charity to the oppressed only treats their symptoms. It's like putting a plaster over a deep wound. It's important and needed, but it doesn't fix the problem. But speaking up against the oppressors can cure the disease. Help and support organizations like Aid and Advocacy that do both. Humanitarian aid is crucial, but fighting for justice brings real change. As Muslims, it's our duty to stand up for the truth. Do your part by supporting Aid and Advocacy.
You've written for many acclaimed international publications, New York Times, The Independent, and many others.
Yes.
Whilst I was studying for my master's, my postgrad in print journalism, the founding principles of the free press is to educate and inform,
yes,
to entertain, to hold power to account, and to remain impartial at all times.
Right.
Would you agree that's kind of the four founding pillars of the free press?
That's what they teach you in journalism school.
Yeah. Does the impartiality actually exist as Zafar?
Well, you see, this is the thing. I mean, I'm not sure that it does. Yeah. And I'm not sure that it should. I mean, I think you need to be fair. You need to be unbiased. But, everyone has a point of view. And I think everyone ought to have a point of view. And I actually think, and what you were talking about is kind of, what they teach in like journalism schools in the West. And when I talk to journalists from the West, they often sort of use that as a founding principle. I feel that here in Bangladesh, at least, certainly, and perhaps this is true for anyone who's a journalist in a developing country, we can't actually be on the fence. We can't be impartial. You do have to take sides, and that's why we got into journalism in the first place. And so I sometimes feel that our imperatives are a little bit different from what I see. And, and maybe there's a lesson here, so much of the world, right, in terms of the ethics of the world, it is, we've learned it. You went to a Western university, I went to a Western university, so you learn these ethics. But, why should why should the learning go from west to east, from north to south? Why shouldn't it come from us? We have a different experience. I have a different understanding. I know a lot of people say, well, it's not my job as a journalist. I report the truth and let the chips fall where they may. Okay. But that's unacceptable to me.
Yeah.
I think the impact of what I write and the impact of what I report is absolutely important. I cannot divorce myself from that. I cannot wash my hands off of what is going to happen is a result of what I have reported. In times of injustice, you have to take a side. Okay, in just being impartial and saying, well, they said this and they said that. To me, that's just not acceptable. And that may be a foundational tenet of what is considered good journalism. But as I said, that's how they look at it in the West. Maybe there's time to come up with a new school, a new understanding of journalism, which says, no, a journalist is not a stenographer. Okay, a journalist absolutely has a affirmative duty to the truth, an affirmative duty to justice, and that actually means taking sides.
The interim government, a future Bangladeshi government, are there any kind of press reforms that you'd like to see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually easy. There's a media commission which has been formed. I don't even think we need a commission. I just think we need a very straight understanding. Let the media, report. Let them do their job. Let us do our job. I don't think it's complicated.
Does Bangladesh need an equivalent of, let's say, Ofcom or IPSO?
I'm sorry, those are media?
Yeah, so Ofcom is the government regulatory body for broadcast in the UK. IPSO is its equivalent for print journalism.
Yeah.
Do you feel that?
How do they operate? I'm not familiar.
So for example, in overseas, things like libel, defamation, what you can and can't say when it comes to misrepresentation.
Right.
Does such a thing exist?
Well, we have something called the Press Council, and a lot of people think, and I think this is a good idea, is that, these kinds of complaints should be taken to the Press Council. Right now, they are actually handled in a court of law. And it's a real problem. We have criminal defamation. So, which is really quite unacceptable. And we also have this very strange norm in Bangladesh. So let's say you think I have defamed you.
Yeah.
You're perfectly, it's perfectly okay for you to file a case against me. But in Bangladesh, what happens, you have third parties filing cases, which is completely unacceptable. So that means someone will say, I'm filing a case on behalf of Dilly because I think he has been defamed. And then 50 people can file a case. So all of a sudden, instead of me facing one case, I'm facing 50 cases. And they could be in courts the length and breadth of Bangladesh. So, these kinds of practices need to be eliminated. And we really need to be given the freedom to publish what we want without fear of that kind of reprisal. That said, of course, journalists need to be responsible. You cannot publish falsehood. You cannot publish misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and there do need to be consequences.
Because there are real-life implications.
Real-life implications. And I'll tell you, we have this a law in this part of the world about religious sentiment, you see? And there's a reason for that, because the thing is this, it is a very volatile it is a very volatile country, and people's religious beliefs are important to them. And so, these things could, it's like a tinderbox, and you could actually have riots. You could actually have massive protests which could leave people dead. So we have to really bear in mind what is the context of the society in which we're living, where we talk about these things. Again, like I said, Bangladesh is not the UK. Bangladesh is not the US. We need to come up with an understanding and rules which are germane to our society. So certainly we need rules in place to make sure that journalism is responsible, to make sure that people do not peddle fake news, and that the fake news then cannot be whipped up into something which will lead to violence. That said, I think it's very easy to actually craft laws in such a way that you can make sure that the abuses are taken care of without stepping on the toes of working journalists. See, the problem with the Digital Security Act and the Cyber Security Act, which the last government put in place, is they said, no. You see, their argument was, look, this is there so we can protect people's rights. But if you saw how it was implemented, if you saw who the cases were brought against, it was clear that that wasn't true. They were used 100% to stifle legitimate journalism, okay? And they were not used in order to make sure that disinformation and misinformation was not peddled. In fact, the most active purveyors of misinformation and disinformation was the outgoing government, and that has actually been proved. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that. Facebook banned a number of accounts, in the run-up to the 2024 election, the run-up to the 2018 election, and then they said, and they had traced these accounts back to individuals and groups with ties to the Awami League government.
Crazy. I'm glad you mentioned religious sensitivities because as the editor and co-founder of a Muslim publication in the West, if I was to now transfer that to my motherland here, is there a place for faith-based news or partisan news in Bangladesh?
Well, it depends what you mean. I think most Bangladeshis take their faith very seriously. It is an integral part of how most Bangladeshis identify themselves. So you can't, separate it out. Now that said, would there be the need for a faith-based publication? Perhaps not, simply because I feel that the mainstream publications include issues of faith to a far greater extent than a mainstream publication would.
What about
in the UK?
What about interpreting current affairs and developments in the country from a faith-based perspective?
You see, so the way I would look at it is the editor of Dhaka Tribune is I would welcome, not just would, I'm not speaking hypothetically, I have welcomed people who write articles based on that, with that perspective. And I think it is an important perspective, and I think it's a perspective
to allow that space.
To allow that space. So here's the thing, I think you have 5 pillars in the UK because you are not getting that space in the mainstream media.
Absolutely.
You see? Whereas what I think in Bangladesh is we can create that space in the mainstream media. And to the extent that we fail to create that space, then absolutely publication should exist which fill up that space, because there is a need to talk about these things. But I'm very proud of the fact that, we have in fact given space to these kinds of ideas, because I think, talking about morality, talking about ethics, talking about Islamic philosophy, and how does it impact us in terms of being a citizen? How does it impact us in terms of being a Bangladeshi? How does it impact us in terms of nation building? I think these are discussions which are important to have.
Now, in the UK, you'll have various news publications that overtly align themselves, especially during general election times, with a certain party. So, for example, when Tony Blair came to power, there was no hiding that he made deals with Rebecca Brooks, the Sun newspaper, right-leaning, left-leaning, centre-left, centre-right. It's not uncommon.
No, you got the Guardian, you got the Telegraph.
Exactly, and they will back certain parties and they'll back certain policies, whether it's Brexit or whatever it may be. Is there a space for partisanship in media?
I mean, I think again,
can the Dhaka Tribune? So let's say an election takes place in the next year or so.
Yeah.
Should you be in a position where editorially you back one of the parties?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because in Bangladesh, you can't do that. And I see this in America, I see this in the UK, the New York Times.
There's a law preventing?
There's no law, but it's to do with the norms. Okay. And it's to do with how Bangladeshi society works. Right now, that said, a lot of newspapers definitely have a leaning.
Yeah.
Right? But again, you have to, it's all a question of the editor. Where do you draw that line? So let's say I am, I would say it's okay to be a newspaper, say, I'm going to be a pro-Awami League newspaper, I'm going to be a pro-BNP newspaper, I'm going to be a pro-Jamaat newspaper. I think that is fine. But the issue is, where do you draw that line? If you are going to go and support everything your party does,
that's a problem.
Come thick or thin, and it doesn't matter what they do, you're going to end up supporting them. That, to me, is unacceptable. If you retain the independence and you retain the flexibility to flip and say, something, I'm an Awami League newspaper, what the Awami League has done is unacceptable, I'm no longer supporting that. If you retain that flexibility, you have my respect. But I think the danger is that you will have newspapers which are just essentially party organs. And that, of course, I think there's no room for that.
Do you want to make a real difference for Palestine? Here's your chance. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? What is your Islam worth if you remain silent in the face of a genocide? Every bombing in Palestine tests your faith. As Muslims, it's our duty to stand against oppression. Our beloved Prophet ﷺ said, whoever among you sees evil, let him change it with his hand. If he's unable to do so, then let his tongue speak against it. And the lowest form of Iman is to hate it from within. Right now, our brothers and sisters in Palestine are suffering terrible persecution. 120,000 people have been martyred, 70% of whom were women and children. But what have you done about it? Help make a real change by supporting both aid and advocacy for Palestine. Apart from delivering aid, Human Aid has been advocating for the rights of Palestinians since 2010. Help support Human Aid and advocacy to support real change.
Bringing our conversation to somewhat of a close.
Yeah.
One of the things we saw after August the 5th was a lot of disinformation and misinformation,
Yeah.
a lot of fake news, sadly coming from India.
Yes.
A nation that for years we were at least told was a brother nation.
Indeed.
A nation that helped Bangladesh get its independence. But it seemed that many prominent pundits, we're not talking about anonymous accounts,
No?
were spreading horrific levels of disinformation in an attempt to either springboard Hasina back
Yes.
or to just continue the kind of communal tensions here. What are your thoughts on that on that fake news?
No, I mean, it was absolutely outrageous and shocking. And as you say, it was not nameless, faceless, sort of third parties. These were establishment figures in the media, in the government, very respected former diplomats, the full-on Indian establishment. And they were peddling a lot of misinformation. They were talking about, attacks on minorities. They completely blew it way out of proportion. They were talking about, Bangladesh as being, sort of
Taken over by Islamists.
They were absolutely, absolutely sort of incorrect. I wrote a piece, which is then published in a number of publications in India, 10 things Indians need to know about Bangladesh. And I said, this is really important, but the battle is real because it's still going on. It is still going on, and the interim government is still under a great deal of pressure. And I think India really needs to understand, Bangladesh is an independent sovereign nation. And, we have to allow us to make our own decisions. And I do understand that they maybe felt some level of kinship, if not ownership, of the league. This has come as a great shock to them. But, they have to understand the sentiments, the popular sentiments which removed Hasina in August. And that, and if they are, and sometimes I worry and I wonder, is their goal that they would like to see Hasina back in power? Because if that's what they're thinking, they really need to understand where the mindset of the Bangladeshi people are. And they really need to make peace with the interim government. They need to make peace with whoever is going to be elected to power after the next election. You cannot have a situation where you have a relationship with a political party as opposed to a country.
Absolutely.
And it's really, I think in many ways, many Bangladeshis have been really shocked to see the extent of, because until this, this is our neighbor, as you said. They were our allies in 1971. We didn't expect to see this level of vitriol coming from across the border. And to this day, there's a big problem. I mean, and here's the thing, we cannot afford to have a poor relationship with India. We have a 4,000-kilometer border with them. They're our biggest neighbors. They're a big trading partner, second biggest after China. We must have a good relationship with India, but the problem is on the Indian side. We are not creating any problem. Professor Yunus wanted to meet Modi in New York. It was Modi who took the decision not to take that meeting. So we are doing everything we can to smooth out the differences and saying, well, look, we understand that the Awami League is no longer there, but we want a good relationship with India. It's the intransigence is coming from the Indian side, and this is really something which we're going to have to deal with. Hopefully, my hope is that this is a temporary thing, that basically it's really a function of the shock. And, I guess they've seen that their foreign policy, their security policy, and the intelligence failure of everything that happened, because they really didn't see this coming. And that has kind of, because of that, they've been in shock for the last 2 or 3 months, and that slowly that will play itself out, and that they will see reality, and that they will understand that there does need to be a fundamental realignment with how they look at Bangladesh. And I think that would be good. Obviously, it's going to be important for Bangladesh. I think it's going to be good for India as well.
Has there been a shift in the public opinion against India and Bangladesh?
I'll be honest with you, the truth of the matter is, for a number of reasons, largely stemming from when the BJP under Modi took office, India's reputation and popularity in Bangladesh has been pretty low for a while. when you have the Home Minister referring to Bangladeshis as termites,
Yes.
it doesn't really do much to endear yourself to the Bangladeshi people. And so much of the overt, and this is the point, it's not covert, it's not hidden, very overt rhetoric of the BJP is fundamentally anti-Bangladeshi, is fundamentally anti-Muslim.
Yeah.
Okay? And this really doesn't sit well with Bangladeshis. So, and they were, of course, seen to be the primary supporter of an extremely unpopular Awami League government. And so India's reputation and popularity in Bangladesh was already pretty low. I think what has happened post August 5th is absolutely just bottomed out. But, because people, it was low, but people didn't realize that they would go to that extent.
I've genuinely found it very hard to find a positive opinion of India since I've been here.
Yes.
Honestly, and this is from even relatives who may have been sympathetic or had a positive opinion of India. It's just very hard to find.
You're absolutely right. The article I wrote, 10 Things India Needs to Know About Bangladesh, that point 10, I said was, the first 9 points I explained how India was, the missteps India had made and what they needed to understand in terms of how to deal with Bangladesh. So my point 10 was, be the above as it may, all of the above as it may, we still want to be friends. In the comments, when we published this online, all of the comments were like, love the piece except point 10. So I'm, like I said, I'm trying to tell my Indian friends, listen, I'm coming from a moderate position. Trust me, my position, if you think this is anti-Indian, my position is the moderate opinion. Yeah. A lot of people are way more negative than me, most people. In fact, possibly all people.
Just want to wrap up with a couple of things that claims, opinions that have been affiliated to both the student movement and advisors and the interim government. The critics of Professor Yunus is he's an American stooge.
Yeah.
And the student-led protesters, they had an American hand to play because they got their eyes on St. Martin's. We spoke a bit about this off camera. How big of a focus is St. Martin's, from your understanding, to the Americans and the geopolitics of the region?
Okay, I think St. Martin's is a red herring. I've talked with friends and people who are in the strategic community, and they say, look, St. Martin could never be a naval base because it's the water surrounding it isn't deep enough. So it's absolutely a red herring. Does America want a greater influence in Bangladesh? Absolutely. I think what it is this. You see, ever since India and America signed the nuclear deal in 2011, I think it was, America has essentially subcontracted its policy in South Asia out to India and has looked at Bangladesh in maybe other countries as well through Indian eyes. And I think what they understood over the last few years, that this was a losing strategy, that they needed to have an independent relationship with Bangladesh because India was becoming more and more unpopular, and India has its own agenda in this area, which may not be completely coterminous with America's agenda. So certainly America does want, a greater role here in Bangladesh than it had previously, and they were looking for people, who could make that happen. And I think that, that is understandable. That's geopolitics. The notion that means that this is it's an American sponsored movement.
Have you heard this claim?
I've heard this claim, and we've even written articles debunking it as well in the newspaper. At a very basic level, it is insulting to the Bangladeshi people. Okay, and it doesn't give the agency to the Bangladeshi people. This was something which the Bangladeshi people, very specifically the young Bangladeshi people, made happen. So any suggestion that this is from was somehow instigated from outside, I think does the young Bangladeshis who put their lives on the line, who lost their lives, who were maimed in their thousands, it does them a disservice. And it also really underplays the level of unpopularity which was enjoyed by the Awami League. And you also have to understand that at every moment from July 15 to August 4th, Hasina took steps which exacerbated the situation. She could have, at any moment in time, she could have taken a different step which would have changed things.
Would have been different.
And she didn't. And so that's, if this is supposed to be some big conspiracy, how can you conspire for her to take the wrong steps? So, this is just, it's just kind of like, conspiracy theories. It's just from people who are wanting to try and, not look at their own failures, not look at what they have done wrong, and always, try and say that, one of the things we hear is forget about America. We hear that this is Pakistan inspired. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, Bangladesh is now a bigger country than Pakistan.
Exactly.
Okay, our economy is big on a per capita basis. It's 30% bigger. It's insulting to us to think that, that somehow, that Pakistan is I wrote this in a piece. I said, who next? Is the Maldives behind this? Is Brunei behind this? I mean, come on, a little respect, please.
Final question, Zafar Bhai.
Yeah.
Mashallah, the student movement achieved monumental thing, historic, right? We can agree as that much. It'll go down as a history books. Nations around the world have been speaking about it. But there's also this kind of feeling that, okay, you've done what you've had to do. Mm-hmm. The country needs to now move on. Chhatra League has literally, yesterday was banned.
That's right.
And there's a criticism that, normality needs to resume. Mm-hmm. Students need to go back to being students. Mm-hmm. An election needs to take place. What are your thoughts, your concluding thoughts on generally the next 6 to 12 months in Bangladesh? Could we see an election, or do you think?
Sure.
Or do you think there'll be a longer holdout?
Okay. No, I mean it's a very complex situation. I actually wouldn't say that the stumbling block or the key variable is the students per se. Okay. Now we have two things here. Of course, we do want elections. At some point in time. We want an elected government in place. What everyone in Bangladesh is hoping for is that there would be time to have reforms such that the abuses which we saw, and frankly, not just the last 15 years, but the last 52 years, can never be repeated. We never want to be in a situation where the Bangladeshi people can be oppressed by our rulers the way we were in the past. And I think that is a very noble goal to hold close. And I think it is worthwhile taking the time to try and institute the reforms so that when we do get an elected government in the future, it's not going to be like the elected government and the governments of the past. I think this is a very important consideration. And so in that sense, I'm aligned with the students' vision. I think most Bangladeshis are aligned with the students' vision. This is actually what Bangladeshis wanted. This is why Bangladeshis welcomed the interim government under Professor Muhammad Yunus, rather than saying, well, let's have elections right away. They understood that things had been so corrupted, so broken over the last 15 years. And as I said, and there were imperfections even before that we really need to fix this. Otherwise, they're going to be back in the same situation again. We're going to have a quote-unquote sort of elected autocracy, and no one wants that. Now, I think the key variable, however, is the ability of the interim government to be able to govern the country. Bangladesh is not an easy country to govern. Mm-hmm. Okay, it is, and certainly after 15 years of massive misgovernance by the Awami League, with the destruction of all the institutions, with massive corruption, massive cronyism, there have been big problems with our banking sector. All of these things are not easy to fix. Okay, and it's very, very difficult for an interim government, who do not have any experience of governance to fix. I think they're doing a great job, but it's not easy. And so what remains to be seen is whether they will be able to actually, you see, here's the thing, reforms are all well and good, but more important even than reforms is the day-to-day governance of the country.
Yeah.
What do people really care about? Ultimately, they want law and order. Ultimately, they want the economy to be functioning. So if you're not able to deliver on those grounds, then you're not going to be given the space you need to enact medium-term and long-term reforms. And, and the law and order situation is very difficult because the police force was so corrupted and compromised after 15 years of Awami League rule, a large chunk of the police force have not reported back to duty. And, and then you can't just make police officers out of nothing. These things take time. And I have to say, one thing that's actually proud of being Bangladeshi is that we had no police force for about a week after the government fell on the 5th. If this had happened in any other country, there'd have been chaos in this country.
Looting.
Imagine this in the UK or the US. It would be insane. But Bangladesh, it was okay. We survived. It was not that bad. There was a little bit of anarchy. There was a little bit of criminality, but nothing compared to what you would see elsewhere. And I think that speaks very well of the Bangladeshi people. So I think the variable is whether the interim government is able to actually hold things together. My sense is they are going to find this tricky. I would expect initially, there was talk as to be whether we would have the government in place 3 years, even 3 to 6 years was initially what people were saying, really give them time to sort things out. My sense is that's not going to play out. My sense is probably by the end of next year, the end of 2025 or early 2026, we're going to see a renewed push for elections, and that's probably going to be where the nation is. And I think where the nation is, that's where the students will be. The students, of course, being young, being idealistic, they do want to see reforms. They want to see the reforms put in place before you have the elections. But we all want that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, also, they're not without political sophistication. So I think if they see that the day-to-day is getting too out of control and too unstable, they also will see the benefit of elections sooner rather than later.
Zafar, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
I enjoyed it very much myself.
When's Dhaka Tribune kicking off their podcast?
Soon. I will show you. We have everything set up in another room, okay. But I just need to actually sit down and find the time to actually do it. So, inshallah, very soon. And you have inspired me now. Sitting here with you, I am. It has really given me the impetus that I've really got to do this.
Make sure you invite me onto the show.
I shall. One good turn deserves another.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I hope you all thoroughly enjoyed the first podcast from Bangladesh. Do leave a comment, share this video. You can find this episode on all 3 seasons and all the major audio platforms. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.